England under Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I.
Introduction to main characters. First is Elizabeth I, who lived from 1533 to 1603 and ruled from 1558 to 1603. Next is Mary I, who lived from 1516 to 1558 and ruled from 1553 to 1558.
Queens Mary and Elizabeth were half-sisters. They shared a father who was King Henry VIII of England. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, and Mary's mother was Henry's first wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon.
This is a scale of the English monarchy on its Protestant to Catholic scale. On the very Protestant side, we've got Thomas Cranmer, and on the very Catholic side, we have Queen Mary I. The various English monarchs are in between.
The Tudor family tree begins with Henry VIII, King of England, who lived from 1509 to 1547. He marries his dead brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, on June 11, 1509. Together they have a child, Mary Tudor, the future Queen Mary I. Henry divorces Catherine for not producing a male heir and marries Anne Boleyn in 1533. He and Anne have a child, the future Queen Elizabeth I. Anne was executed in 1536 after charges of adultery. He then marries again, this time to Jane Seymour, who gives him an heir, King Edward VI. Jane, however, dies in childbirth. The story of Queens Mary I and Elizabeth I starts at the deathbed of King Edward VI. King Edward VI died at age 16 on July 6, 1553, from smallpox, measles, and pulmonary tuberculosis. Before his death, Edward had devised with the Earl of Northumberland to name 15-year-old Lady Jane Grey, daughter of Suffolk, as his successor. On May 21, 1553, Jane had married Lord Guildford Dudley, the Earl's son. She was a devout Protestant and was a way to prevent the throne from entering into the control of Catholic Mary. But she only ruled for 9 days as Mary took control because she was the rightful heir. Jane and her husband were thrown into the Tower of London and executed on February 12, 1554.
I'm your sister, so I should be queen. Oh. Let's put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. She's a devout Protestant.
King Edward VI died at age 16 on July 6, 1553 of
Mary, you are now the Queen of England. Do you accept your duties?
I do.
England under Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor was born on February 18, 1516, to King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Mary was the first female ruler of England. On July 25, 1554, Mary married Philip II of Spain, one of the most powerful men in Europe at the time. He was 11 years younger than her. Philip was also the son of King Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. Philip was an absent husband. He was often in Spain or the Netherlands, but not with Mary. Mary and Philip's marriage was unsatisfactory. While Mary was devoted to Philip, he did not reciprocate her affections. Philip used Mary as a chess piece, as he never really did love her. The marriage of Mary I and Philip II of Spain was a political marriage, as they both needed each other to maintain their power. Yet, this newfound power can be easily abused just as it was by Philip II of Spain. He convinced Mary to enter war against the French, which was an utter disaster for the English and poor judgment on Mary's part. In 1554, the same year that Mary marries Philip of Spain, is the same year that Parliament meets to re-establish Catholicism in England, and the same year that the persecution of Protestants begins. The Heresy laws are revived, and England is reconciled to papal authority. As we know, Mary was a religious Catholic and began her rule with eradicating the Protestant reforms that had developed under her brother King Edward VI. She arrested important Protestant leaders, and she suspected her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, of plotting against her with Sir Thomas Wyatt, who staged a revolt to dispose of Mary in 1554. Due to her suspicion of her sister and many others, in 1554, Mary locks Princess Elizabeth, her half-sister, into the Tower of London on suspicion of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. 2 months later, in the year 1555, Princess Elizabeth is released. Due to the English Protestant fears of Queen Mary I, they fled the state to modern-day Germany and Switzerland, which served as a safe haven for many Protestants. They had 2 options: to either flee the country or to die. The ones who ran were referred to as Marian exiles. Among them was a future leader of the Reformation in Scotland, John Knox. The individual unknown Protestants stayed in the country while the known Protestants had fled to the safe havens, and they had to live a life of lies under the overbearing Queen Mary I. Mary I was an overbearing power upon her people. Just as Machiavelli had said, it is better to be feared than to be loved, and Mary lived by this line. She instilled fear within her subjects by using her public executions as a deterrent for ones contemplating converting to Lutheranism or Calvinism over Catholicism. For as many as there were that did not like Queen Mary I's views or actions, there were others who believed she could do no wrong. These are the people that were just like her. They have no fears of being murdered by her because they have similar views and are as devoutly Catholic as Mary herself. These would be the ones that helped her rise to the throne after the death of her younger half-brother, Edward VI. Queen Mary I of England suffered from a phantom pregnancy in 1555, putting a larger strain on her already strained marriage with Philip II of Spain. This strain can be partially credited to the pressure to produce an heir, which they have not yet done. During this is when Mary finds out that she has ovarian cancer, which causes her demise in 1558 at St. James's Palace. When news broke of Queen Mary I's death and Elizabeth rising to the throne, the Protestants who had fled the state were now safe and free to come back to the state. Many of them later held positions in the Church of England under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I. Mary died on November 17, 1558, unhappily knowing her Protestant sister, Queen Elizabeth I, would succeed her. The common person under Queen Mary I. England remained poor throughout Queen Mary I's reign and Queen Elizabeth I's reign. Sadly, Queen Mary I of England dies of ovarian cancer on November 17, 1558. Her Protestant half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, rises to the throne, succeeding her on January 15, 1559. For England, this was quite a change in the way their leaders view religion, Elizabeth being a Protestant and Mary being a devout Catholic. Fun fact, Mary only ruled for 5 years, 3 months, and 29 days, while Elizabeth ruled for 44 years, 4 months, and 5 days. Queen Elizabeth I is officially recognized as Queen Elizabeth I on January 15, 1559, only a few months after the former queen and her half-sister, Queen Mary I, has died.
Elizabeth, you are now Queen of England. Do you accept your duties?
Yes.
England under Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I worked to maintain a more moderate religious church, although she herself was a Protestant. She was a prime example of a politique, a person who put a country's political unity over their own personal religious convictions. In 1559, Mary Queen of Scots declares herself Queen of France, Scotland, and England in Paris when her husband Francis becomes King of France. He dies a year later and Mary returns to Scotland.
In 1559, the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity restore the Protestant Church in England and make Elizabeth head of the Church of England. The revised prayer book of Elizabeth I is issued. It is less extreme than its predecessors.
Queen Elizabeth I, or commonly known as the Virgin Queen, had a multitude of marriage proposals, including one from Mary's widower husband, Philip II of Spain. She had many close friendships with noblemen at court, but she hated marriage and maintained her independence by refusing to marry, thus the name the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth was so fed up with the talk of her marriage prospects that she forbid Parliament from ever speaking of it to her or to anyone else. From 1563 to 1564, 17,000 English subjects died of the plague in London, which is believed to have been brought back by the troops returning from La Havre.
After the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Elizabeth quietly sent money and munitions to the Huguenots of France, but remained publicly on friendly terms with the French Catholic regime.
In February 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicates Elizabeth I and calls her a heretic due to the fact that she is a Protestant. In 1565, Sir Walter Raleigh returns to the Queen's court from the New World bearing tobacco and potatoes. In the year 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh founds the first American colony and names it Virginia after Elizabeth I, also known as the Virgin Queen. In 1568, Mary Queen of Scots flees to England from Scotland and is imprisoned by Queen Elizabeth I. She remains in prison for 19 years up until her death. While she is in prison, she plots with the Babington Catholics to assassinate Queen Elizabeth and to have her rise to the throne. In 1586, the Babington Catholics plot to assassinate Elizabeth I, and Mary Queen of Scots, who fled from Scotland to England, is implicated in the Babington plot and is sent to trial. Just a year later, in 1587, Queen Mary of Scots is executed on charges of treason towards Queen Elizabeth I. After the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Elizabeth was the only protector of Protestants in France and in the Netherlands. In 1585, she signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, which provided English soldiers and cavalry to the Netherlands. Funds that had previously been funneled covertly to support Henry of Navarre's army in France now flowed openly. In 1588, a Spanish armada of 130 ships sailing against England is defeated by bad weather and the English fleet under Admiral Drake and John Hawkins using fire ships. Many were wrecked, trying to return by sailing around the north of the British Isles. The English dominance of the sea leaves the way open for English trade and colonization of America and India. In 1589, John Harrington invents the first flushing water closet at his house in Kelston. He calls it the Ajax, a pun on the Elizabethan slang word for jakes, for a privy. Elizabeth I orders a Harrington WC to be installed in Richmond Palace. In 1590, William Shakespeare writes Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream. In 1593, 15,000 Londoners die of the plague. Due to this, all theaters are closed for 1 year. The same year that London is hit with the plague, in 1593, the playwright Christopher Marlowe is murdered. He was an English playwright, poet, and translator of the Elizabethan era. He was also the author of Faustus. Between 1597 and 1599, the Globe Theatre was built, along the River Thames in London. The Globe was built as a large, round, open-air theatre. There was a roof around the circumference which covered the seating area, leaving the theatre looking like a donut from above. There were no actresses performing at the Globe Theatre or any other like them at that time. Female roles were played by young boys at theatre stages were considered too risque for a place for ladies. It can commonly be referred to as the Shakespeare Globe Theatre because William Shakespeare was a shareholder who owned 12.5% of the Globe Theatre. In 1601, Earl of Essex is executed for leading a revolt against Queen Elizabeth I. In 1600, the East India Company was founded. It is also known as the Honourable East India Company or the British East India Company and informally known as John Company. It was an English and later British joint stock company which was formed to pursue trade with the East Indies but ended up trading mainly with the Indian subcontinent of Jing, China. Queen Elizabeth I of England died on March 24, 1603. Her cause of death is believed to have been of blood poisoning. She was nearly 70 years old at the time of her death, and she was arguably the greatest monarch that ever ruled England. Under her rule, England prospered. England became a major power, encouraging the arts and great literature by William Shakespeare, John Donne, Christopher Marlowe, and Sir Edmund Spenser. Great explorers discovered new lands such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir John Hawkins, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and Sir Richard Greenville. The day of her death was a Thursday, the same as her father, King Henry VIII, and her half-sister, Queen Mary I. Her funeral procession consisted of over 1,000 mourners. This number was swelled by the many Londoners who watched the procession from afar. Elizabeth was the fifth and last monarch of the Tudor dynasty. After her death, the throne of England passed on to King James VI of Scotland, who later became King James I of England.